3 years ago, Adrian Blackwell destroyed the woman who saved his life. He fired her without explanation, disappeared without a trace, told himself it was the right decision. But today, in a roadside diner 100 miles from his billion-dollar empire, Adrian came face to face with the woman he thought he'd never see again. Elena Monroe, the waitress he'd loved in secret, the woman he'd betrayed. And she was hiding something. Something that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and the cost of his choices. "You don't get to walk back into our lives," she said, her voice trembling with rage and pain. "Not after what you did. Our lives." The words hung in the air like a threat, like a secret, like a reckoning Adrian wasn't prepared for. What had Elena been hiding all these years? And why did the truth in her eyes look like it would destroy him? Welcome to Mr. Harrington's Stories, where love, betrayal, and redemption collide in the lives of the powerful and the broken. Before we begin, I want to leave you with a blessing. May your week be filled with unexpected grace, second chances, and the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful. If you're here with us right now, type present in the comments. Let's build this community together. And if you believe in justice, if you believe people deserve second chances and the truth always finds its way to the surface, then hit that subscribe button. Because this story will remind you why loyalty, love, and redemption matter. Trolls won't subscribe. But you? You're here for the truth. Elena Monroe was 26 when she learned that hope could be a dangerous thing. She had deep brown skin that glowed softly under the dim lighting of late-night study sessions, natural curls that framed a face still young enough to believe in goodness, and eyes that carried warmth despite everything life had thrown at her. She was the kind of woman who smiled at strangers, who worked until her feet ached, who dreamed quietly in the margins of exhaustion. Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the Sterling, was where Elena spent her days and nights. Double shifts were her reality, carrying trays of champagne to tables she could never afford to sit at, serving meals that cost more than her monthly rent, smiling through the fatigue that lived in her bones. The elite barely saw her. To them, she was just another face in the background of their luxury. But Elena saw everything. She watched the way wealth moved through that dining room like it owned the air itself. She studied the confidence of women draped in diamonds, the casual arrogance of men who'd never known struggle. And she wondered sometimes what it would feel like to live without counting every dollar, without the weight of survival pressing down on her chest every single morning. Late at night, after her shifts ended and the city finally quieted, Elena sat at her tiny kitchen table studying for her nursing certification. Her textbooks were secondhand, pages worn and highlighted by someone else's dreams. But they were hers now. Nursing was her way out, a path to stability, to security, to a life where she didn't have to choose between paying rent and eating well. She was exhausted, bone-tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. But Elena Monroe had learned early that rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she pushed forward, day after day, believing that somewhere on the other side of this struggle was something better. Something real. She just didn't know how dangerous that hope would become. The night Adrian Blackwell collapsed at table 12, Elena didn't hesitate. While others panicked, she acted. It happened fast. One moment, the dining room hummed with the usual symphony of clinking glasses and low conversations. The next, chaos erupted near the back corner where the most powerful guests always sat. A man was gasping, clawing at his throat, his face draining of color as his body rejected something it couldn't fight. Adrian Blackwell, 34 years old, CEO of Blackwell Global Enterprises. A man whose face appeared on magazine covers, whose decisions moved markets, whose empire stretched across continents. Powerful, untouchable, and in that moment, dying. The restaurant staff froze. Guests stood from their tables, unsure whether to help or simply watch. But Elena's training kicked in before her fear could catch up. She'd taken emergency response courses as part of her nursing studies. She knew what a severe allergic reaction looked like. She didn't ask permission. She ran to the emergency kit mounted near the kitchen, grabbed the EpiPen with steady hands, and pushed through the crowd gathering around his table. His date, a woman dripping in pearls and panic, had backed away, one hand covering her mouth in horror. Elena knelt beside Adrian, her fingers finding his pulse, her voice calm and clear as she told him to stay with her. She administered the epinephrine with precision, her hands never shaking, her focus absolute. And then she stayed. While paramedics were called, While the restaurant descended into whispered shock, Elena Monroe held Adrian Blackwell's hand and kept him breathing. His gray eyes, sharp and intelligent even through the fog of near death, found hers. They were beautiful eyes, she thought distantly. The kind that seemed to see straight through surfaces into something deeper. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough but sincere. Elena felt something shift in that moment. A connection that had nothing to do with the emergency, nothing to do with the fact that she just saved his life. It was something quieter, more dangerous. The kind of spark that ignites when two people see each other, really see each other, for the first time. She told herself it was just adrenaline. Just the intimacy of a crisis moment. But when Adrian's fingers tightened around hers, when his gaze held hers like she was the only person in the room, Elena felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. The paramedics arrived. Adrian was stabilized, taken to the hospital for observation. And Elena returned to her shift, her heart still racing, her hands still trembling from something that had nothing to do with fear. She didn't expect to see him again. Men like Adrian Blackwell didn't return for women like her. Their worlds didn't overlap. That night was a moment, beautiful and terrifying and impossible to repeat. But she was wrong. For 2 months, Elena lived in a dream she didn't know would become a nightmare. Adrian came back to the Sterling 3 days after his collapse. He requested a table in Elena's section. She thought it was coincidence until she saw the way he watched her, until he stayed long after his meal was finished, until he asked her name like it mattered. He returned the next week. And the week after that. Always the same table. Always asking for her. The other servers noticed. They whispered about it, made jokes Elena pretended not to hear. But she couldn't deny what was happening. Adrian Blackwell was coming back for her. Their conversations started innocently enough. He'd ask about her day, her dreams, what brought her to the Sterling. She'd deflect with humor, keep things light, maintain the professional distance she knew she was supposed to keep. But Adrian was persistent. Not in an aggressive way, in a way that felt like genuine interest. Like he actually wanted to know her. One night, after the restaurant closed, Elena found him waiting in the alley behind the kitchen. She should have walked past him. Should have gone home. But something in his expression stopped her, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. They talked for hours that night. Standing in that narrow alley with the city humming around them, Adrian told her things she suspected he'd never said out loud. About the weight of his empire, the suffocating expectations, the loneliness of power. About how every relationship in his life felt transactional, how everyone wanted something from him, how he couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him like he was just a man instead of a means to an end. Elena understood loneliness. She'd lived with it her entire life. So she shared her own truths, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her exhaustion, her quiet hope that life could be more than survival. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt seen. The kiss happened naturally. One moment they were talking, the next his hand was cupping her face, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness that made her chest ache. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was soft. Searching. Like a question neither of them knew how to ask out loud. That kiss became a secret. Their secret. Adrian started meeting her after her shifts, stealing moments in the alley where no one could see them, where the rules of their different worlds didn't apply. They talked about everything and nothing. He brought her coffee on cold nights. She made him laugh in ways that seemed to surprise him. He told her about the pressure of running Blackwell Global, about board meetings that felt like battlefields, about nights when he lay awake wondering if any of it mattered. She told him about studying until her eyes burned, about the fear that she'd never escape the cycle of working to survive. They fell in love in the shadows. A billionaire and a waitress, hiding from a world that would never accept them. It felt forbidden. Fragile. Intoxicating. Adrian whispered promises in the dark. About taking her away from the Sterling, about giving her a life where she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion. About a future where they didn't have to hide. And Elena, against every instinct screaming at her to protect herself, believed him. She gave him everything. Her trust. Her heart. Her body. She let herself imagine a life beyond struggle, a love that didn't have to live in the margins. For 2 months, Elena Monroe let herself hope. She didn't know she was falling in love with a lie. Elena didn't know Adrian was engaged until Cassandra Vale walked through the door. It was a Tuesday evening, the restaurant half full with the usual crowd of Manhattan's elite. Elena was taking an order when she felt the air in the room shift, the way it does when someone truly powerful enters a space. Cassandra Vale moved through the Sterling like she owned it. Tall and impossibly elegant, with blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than Elena's monthly salary, she carried herself with a kind of confidence that comes from never having to question your place in the world. She was beautiful in a cold, untouchable way. The kind of beauty that intimidated rather than invited. And she walked straight to Adrian's usual table, where he sat alone, waiting for Elena's shift to end. Elena watched from across the dining room as Cassandra leaned down, kissed Adrian's cheek, and sat across from him with the ease of someone who belonged there. She watched as Adrian's expression shifted, surprise, then something like resignation. She watched as Cassandra's hand covered his on the table, possessive and certain. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. This wasn't some ex-girlfriend. This was someone who still had a claim. Someone who fit into Adrian's world in a way Elena never could. She tried to focus on her work, but her hand shook as she poured water, as she delivered meals, as she avoided looking at the table where her entire future was unraveling. And then Cassandra appeared at her side. The conversation was quiet, civil even. But Cassandra's words cut like a blade wrapped in silk. She introduced herself as Adrian's fiancée. The word landed like a bomb Elena hadn't seen coming. Cassandra's smile was pleasant, her tone almost sympathetic, as she explained that Elena had been a distraction. Nothing more. A momentary escape for a man drowning in pressure. Girls like you, Cassandra said softly, her eyes cold despite the smile, are a dime a dozen. Entertaining for a moment. But ultimately, forgettable. Elena felt her world tilt. She looked across the restaurant to where Adrian sat, waiting for him to intervene, to defend her, to tell Cassandra she was wrong. But Adrian said nothing. He wouldn't even meet Elena's eyes. He just sat there, silent and complicit, while the woman he'd supposedly been engaged to the entire time destroyed the fragile hope Elena had been foolish enough to build. Cassandra excused herself with a final warning. Stay away from what's mine. And Elena stood there, frozen in the middle of the Sterling's dining room, understanding with brutal clarity that she had never been Adrian's equal. She had been his escape. His secret. His mistake. She finished her shift in a haze. Adrian left without a word. And Elena went home to her tiny apartment, sat on her bathroom floor, and finally let herself break. The next morning, Elena's life collapsed. The termination notice was waiting for her when she arrived at the Sterling. Signed by Adrian Blackwell himself. No explanation. No conversation. Just a cold, clinical document ending her employment effective immediately. But the firing was only the beginning. Within days, rumors began to spread. Whispers of theft, of misconduct, of inappropriate behavior with guests. Elena tried to defend herself, tried to explain, but the accusations had already taken root. The Sterling's management made it clear, her reputation was ruined. She applied to every restaurant in Manhattan. None would hire her. The whispers had traveled faster than she could run from them. She was blacklisted. Untouchable. Invisible. 2 weeks after Adrian destroyed her employment, Elena discovered she was pregnant. She stared at the positive test in her tiny bathroom, her hands shaking, her mind unable to process the cruelty of the timing. She was jobless. Broke. Alone. And carrying the child of a man who'd thrown her away like she was nothing. Elena tried to reach him. She called his office dozens of times, only to be told Mr. Blackwell was unavailable. She wrote letters that were returned unopened. She went to his building, desperate and terrified, only to have security escort her away like she was some kind of threat. She was invisible to him now. Erased. As if those 2 months had never happened. As if the promises he'd whispered in the dark had been nothing but lies he told to pass the time. Elena sat in her apartment, eviction notice on the counter, pregnancy test in her hand, and finally understood the truth. Adrian Blackwell had saved himself. And he'd sacrificed her to do it. So Elena Monroe did the only thing she could. She disappeared. She left Manhattan with what little money she had left, found a small town upstate where no one knew her name or her story, and started over from nothing. And she took his secret with her. Would you have told him about the baby? Or would you have disappeared like Elena did? Let me know in the comments. 3 years later, Elena Monroe had built a new life from the ashes of her old one. The small upstate town where she'd landed didn't have a name most people would recognize. It was the kind of place people passed through on their way to somewhere else. A handful of streets, a gas station, a diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. It was quiet. Unremarkable. Exactly what Elena needed. She worked at that diner now, a roadside place called Rosie's that smelled like bacon grease and hope. The work was honest, the tips were modest, and nobody asked questions about where she'd come from or why a woman with her education was serving pancakes to truckers and travelers. Elena had learned to appreciate anonymity. It was a gift she'd never take for granted again. But the real reason Elena had survived these 3 years, the reason she got up every morning and kept moving forward, had nothing to do with the town or the job or the distance she'd put between herself and Manhattan. It was Lila. Her daughter. 3 years old now, with dark curls that bounced when she laughed and eyes that stopped Elena's heart every single time she looked into them. Gray eyes. Piercing and intelligent and heartbreakingly familiar. Adrian's eyes, living in her daughter's face, a constant reminder of the man Elena had loved and the betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. Lila was everything. She was the reason Elena had fought through homelessness and poverty and the crushing weight of raising a child alone. She was the reason Elena had learned to be strong in ways she'd never imagined, had discovered reserves of courage she didn't know existed. Motherhood had changed Elena. It had hardened her in some ways, made her guarded, careful, slower to trust. The soft hopefulness that had once lived in her eyes had been replaced by something sharper, more vigilant. She didn't believe in fairy tales anymore. Didn't believe in promises whispered in the dark or in men who claimed to love her. But motherhood had also healed her. Every time Lila wrapped her small arms around Elena's neck, every time she said mama with that sweet, trusting voice, Elena felt pieces of her broken heart knit back together. Lila had given her purpose. Had reminded her that she was more than what Adrian had made her feel, more than disposable, more than forgettable. Elena had survived. And she built a life worth living, even if it looked nothing like the dreams she'd once carried. But every time she looked at her daughter, she saw him. And the past Elena had tried so hard to bury felt dangerously close to the surface. Meanwhile, Adrian Blackwell's perfect world was falling apart. It started with small things. Documents missing from his office. Deals falling through at the last minute. Confidential information appearing in competitors' hands before Adrian's own team could act on it. At first, he blamed incompetence, tightened security, fired people he thought were leaking information. But the problems persisted. And eventually, the truth became impossible to ignore. Cassandra. His fiancée. The woman he'd chosen over Elena. The woman whose family connections and media empire had seemed like the logical choice for a man building a dynasty. Cassandra Vale had been betraying him from the inside for over a year. Corporate espionage. Sabotaged contracts. Leaked secrets to rivals. She'd been systematically trying to destroy Blackwell Global while wearing his ring and sleeping in his bed. And the affairs. There had been so many affairs. Men from her social circle, business rivals, anyone who could give her leverage or information or simply entertain her while Adrian worked 18-hour days to save the empire she was burning down around him. The evidence, when it finally surfaced, was damning. Emails. Financial transfers. A paper trail so obvious Adrian couldn't believe he'd missed it. But he had missed it. Because he'd been too consumed with guilt, too haunted by memories of a woman with warm eyes and gentle hands who he destroyed to save himself. Elena. He thought about her constantly. In board meetings, he'd remember the way she laughed. At charity galas surrounded by Manhattan's elite, he'd remember conversations in that alley behind the Sterling, talking about things that actually mattered. Alone in his penthouse overlooking a city that felt increasingly empty, he'd remember the way she'd looked at him, like he was just a man, not an empire, not a name, not a means to an end. Elena had been real. The only real thing in his carefully constructed life. And he'd thrown her away like she was nothing. Cassandra was arrested on multiple charges. Corporate crimes, fraud, conspiracy. Adrian's legal team had built an airtight case. His empire survived intact, his reputation defended by the best lawyers money could buy. But his life felt hollow. The penthouse was too quiet. Success tasted like ash. And every morning when Adrian woke up alone, he understood with brutal clarity that he'd won everything that didn't matter and lost the only thing that did. Then one afternoon, Going through old files his team had recovered during the investigation, Adrian found something that made his blood run cold. The rumors about Elena, the theft allegations, the misconduct reports that had gotten her blacklisted across Manhattan, they'd been fabricated. Every single one. Cassandra had manufactured the lies, had pressured Adrian to fire Elena, had systematically destroyed her reputation to eliminate what she'd seen as a threat. Adrian had believed the lies. Had trusted Cassandra's word over Elena's character. Had signed the termination papers without question because it had seemed easier than fighting, safer than risking his engagement to a woman whose family controlled half the media in New York. He'd destroyed Elena based on lies. And she'd never stood a chance against the machine Cassandra had built to crush her. The guilt was suffocating. It kept Adrian awake at night, turned food to cardboard in his mouth, made every breath feel like a betrayal. He'd ruined an innocent woman. A woman who'd saved his life, who'd loved him when he'd given her nothing but secrets and broken promises. He had to find her. Had to apologize, explain, do something, anything, to make it right. Adrian hired investigators. He had to find her. He had to make it right. The search took weeks. Elena Monroe had disappeared completely after leaving Manhattan. No forwarding address, no social media presence, no digital footprint to follow. She'd vanished like she'd never existed. But Adrian had resources. And eventually, his investigators found a lead. A woman matching Elena's description working at a diner in a small town upstate. Living quietly. Keeping to herself. Adrian drove there himself. 3 hours north of Manhattan, watching the city fade in his rearview mirror as the landscape shifted to something quieter, simpler. He rehearsed what he'd say. How he'd apologize. How he'd explain that Cassandra had manipulated everything, that the lies hadn't been his, that he'd been a coward but not a monster. But even as he practiced the words, Adrian knew they weren't enough. Nothing he could say would undo the damage. Nothing would give Elena back the months she'd spent homeless and pregnant and alone because of him. Still, he had to try. He owed her that much. He owed her everything. As Adrian pulled into the parking lot of Rosie's diner, his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Hope and dread warred in his chest. What if she refused to see him? What if she told him to leave and never come back? What if the woman he remembered, the woman with the warm smile and gentle hands, was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, someone who looked at him with nothing but hate? Adrian took a breath, straightened his suit jacket, ridiculous in this setting, but he hadn't known what else to wear, and walked toward the entrance. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. And then Adrian Blackwell walked through the door and saw the truth that would undo him. The diner was modest. Clean but worn, with red vinyl booths and a counter lined with stools. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. A few customers sat scattered throughout, an elderly couple sharing pie, a truck driver reading a newspaper, a young family with 2 small children. And behind the counter, wearing a simple uniform and an expression of tired patience, was Elena. Time stopped. Adrian's heart forgot how to beat. She was more beautiful than he remembered. 3 years had changed her. There was something stronger in the set of her shoulders, something sharper in her eyes. But she was still Elena. Still the woman who'd haunted his dreams every night since he'd destroyed her. She hadn't seen him yet. She was wiping down the counter, her movements efficient and practiced. Adrian stood frozen in the doorway, drinking in the sight of her, remembering what it felt like to be near her, to exist in her orbit. Then she looked up. Their eyes met across the diner. Elena's face went pale. The cloth dropped from her hand. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with 3 years of silence, betrayal, and words that had never been spoken. Adrian opened his mouth to say her name, to apologize, to explain. But before he could speak, his attention was caught by movement to Elena's left. A little girl emerged from the kitchen area. Small, no more than 3 years old, with dark curls that bounced as she walked and a sippy cup clutched in her tiny hands. She moved to Elena's side with the comfortable ease of a child seeking her mother's presence. And when the little girl looked up at Elena, tilting her head with a question on her lips, Adrian saw her eyes. Gray eyes. Piercing and intelligent. His eyes, staring out of a stranger's face. His daughter's face. The world tilted. Adrian couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was seeing. A child. Elena had a child. His child. The mathematics were undeniable. The timing, the age, those unmistakable gray eyes that came from his family line going back generations. He had a daughter. Elena moved with the speed of instinct, stepping protectively between Adrian and the little girl. Her body became a shield, her expression transforming from shock to something fierce and primal. A mother protecting her young. Adrian tried to speak, but his voice came out broken. Elena. Elena's response was quiet, but edged with steel. You need to leave. The little girl peeked around Elena's legs, curious about the stranger who'd made her mother's voice go hard and scared. Adrian stared at her, at his daughter, trying to memorize every detail. The curve of her cheeks. The way her curls caught the light. The small hand gripping Elena's uniform. Is she? Adrian couldn't finish the question. His throat had closed around the words. Elena's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. Her voice trembled with barely controlled emotion. You lost the right to ask that question the day you signed my termination papers. The words hit Adrian like a physical blow. He'd known he'd hurt Elena. He'd known his betrayal had been cruel. But standing here now, looking at the child he'd never known existed, the child Elena had raised alone while he'd gone on with his life, the full weight of his sins crashed down on him with devastating clarity. He had a daughter who didn't know his name. A daughter who'd taken her first steps, spoken her first words, learned to laugh and play and exist in the world without him. A daughter Elena had carried alone through homelessness and poverty and terror, because he'd been too cowardly to defend her. Adrian felt his carefully constructed world shatter into pieces around him. Elena refused to let him explain. Not after everything. She told him to leave. Her voice was steady now, controlled by the same strength that had carried her through 3 years of single motherhood. She wouldn't let him disrupt Lila's life. Wouldn't let him walk in and upend the stability she'd fought so hard to build. But Adrian couldn't leave. He stepped further into the diner, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, his voice desperate. Please. Just let me explain. Let me apologize. The other customers had gone silent, sensing the tension. The elderly couple exchanged concerned glances. The truck driver pretended to read his newspaper while clearly listening. Adrian didn't care. His entire world had narrowed to the woman in front of him and the child she was protecting. Please, Elena. I know I don't deserve it. I know what I did was unforgivable. But please just give me 5 minutes. Elena's control cracked. Her voice rose, years of buried pain finally erupting to the surface. You don't get to ask for anything. You didn't just fire me, Adrian. You destroyed me. I was homeless, pregnant, terrified, and you wouldn't even take my call. Tears streamed down her face now, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She wanted him to see. Wanted him to understand the depth of what he'd taken from her. I went to your building, Elena continued, her voice breaking. Security dragged me out like I was some kind of criminal. I wrote you letters. I called every number I could find. And you ignored every single one. You made me disappear. You made me nothing. Adrian's own eyes burned. I know. God, Elena, I know. And I will regret it every day for the rest of my life. He told her the truth then. All of it. How Cassandra had fabricated the lies. How she'd manipulated him into firing Elena. How the theft allegations, the misconduct reports, all of it had been manufactured to eliminate Elena as a threat. How he'd been a coward who'd believed lies instead of trusting the woman who'd actually loved him. Elena stared at him, her expression unreadable. And you believed her. You chose her. That's all I need to know. The words hung in the air like a judgment Adrian couldn't appeal. Cassandra is gone, he said quietly. Arrested. Exposed for everything she did. Corporate crimes, espionage, fraud. She tried to destroy my company from the inside. But none of that matters. Because the real destruction was what I did to you. Elena's laugh was bitter. You're free now. How convenient. The little girl, Lila, Adrian had heard Elena call her, tugged on her mother's sleeve. Mama, why are you crying? Elena's face softened instantly. She knelt down, cupping her daughter's face with gentle hands. I'm okay, baby. Just talking to someone. But Lila's gray eyes, so like Adrian's own, were fixed on him now with a child's sharp intuition. Is he making you sad? Before Elena could answer, Adrian spoke directly to his daughter for the first time. "No, sweetheart. I'm the one who's sad. Because I made a terrible mistake a long time ago. And your mama is the strongest, bravest person I've ever known." Lila studied him with an intensity that made Adrian's heart ache. Then she turned back to Elena, satisfied with whatever she'd seen in his face. Elena stood, her body still positioned between Adrian and Lila. "You need to go. We have nothing to say to each other." Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to beg. But he saw the exhaustion in Elena's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly, the fragile control she was maintaining. She was at her limit. And he'd caused enough damage. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But I'm not leaving town. Not until we can talk. Really talk. You don't have to forgive me. I don't expect that. But I'm not walking away from her. From our daughter." Elena's expression hardened. "She's my daughter. You gave up any claim to her 3 years ago." Adrian nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. "You're right. But I'm asking, begging, for a chance to be in her life. Even if you never want to see me again. Even if you hate me forever. Please don't keep me from knowing her." Elena said nothing. She just turned away, ushering Lila back toward the kitchen, leaving Adrian standing alone in the middle of the diner with his heart in pieces and his sins weighing heavy on his shoulders. That night, Lila asked the question Elena had been dreading for 3 years. They were home in their small apartment above the diner. Elena had tucked Lila into bed, read her favorite story about a brave princess who saved herself, and kissed her forehead the way she did every night. But as Elena turned to leave, Lila's small voice stopped her. "Mama, who was that man? Why were you crying?" Elena's breath caught. She'd known this moment would come eventually. Had rehearsed answers in her head. But now, faced with her daughter's innocent curiosity and those gray eyes that belonged to a man Lila had never known, Elena found herself unable to speak. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing Lila's curls back from her face, buying time to find words that wouldn't break her daughter's heart or shatter the careful peace they'd built. "Just someone I used to know," Elena said softly. "A long time ago." But Lila was smart. Perceptive in the way children are when they've learned to read their parents' emotions. She'd watched Elena closely for 3 years, had seen the shadow that sometimes crossed her mother's face, had felt the weight of something unspoken living between them. "He has eyes like mine," Lila said quietly. Elena's composure crumbled. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She gathered Lila into her arms, holding her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo and innocence. "Does he know me?" Lila asked, her voice muffled against Elena's shoulder. The question was so simple, so devastating. Elena thought about lying, about protecting Lila from the truth a little longer. But she'd learned 3 years ago that lies, even well-intentioned ones, eventually destroy everything they touch. "He knows you now, baby," Elena whispered. "And that changes everything." She held her daughter close as Lila drifted off to sleep, her small body warm and trusting in Elena's arms. And Elena understood with perfect clarity that the fragile life she'd built was about to be tested in ways she wasn't prepared for. Because Adrian Blackwell wasn't going to walk away. Not this time. She'd seen it in his eyes, the determination, the regret, the desperate need to fix what he'd broken. He would fight for a place in Lila's life. Would use his resources, his lawyers, his power to claim what he believed was his right. And Elena would have to decide. Could she forgive the man who destroyed her? Could she trust him with the daughter she'd raised alone? Or would she protect Lila from the heartbreak Elena knew too well, the heartbreak of loving someone who could throw you away when it became convenient? The questions kept Elena awake long after Lila's breathing had deepened into sleep. And as dawn began to lighten the sky outside their small window, Elena still didn't have answers. Do you think Adrian deserves a second chance? Or should Elena keep him out of their lives? Comment below. Adrian didn't leave town. Instead, he rented a small house on the outskirts, close enough to see the diner from his window, far enough to give Elena the space she demanded. And then he waited. Every morning, Adrian appeared at Rosie's diner. He'd take the corner booth by the window, order coffee he barely touched, and simply exist in Elena's space. He didn't approach her. Didn't try to force conversation or demand answers. He just sat there, quiet and patient, his presence a constant reminder of everything unresolved between them. The other regulars noticed. whispered about the well-dressed stranger who showed up every day and watched the pretty waitress with haunted eyes. But Adrian didn't care what they thought. He'd spent 3 years caring about appearances, about reputation, about maintaining the perfect image. And it had cost him everything that mattered. He wasn't making that mistake again. Small gifts began appearing. A picture book left on the diner's doorstep, a story about a brave little girl who could do anything. A stuffed animal tucked beside the register when Elena wasn't looking. Children's books about fathers and daughters, about family, about second chances. Never signed. Never announced. But Elena knew exactly who they were from. She wanted to throw them away. Wanted to tell him to stop, that his gestures meant nothing, that he couldn't buy his way back into their lives with presence and persistence. But every time Lila's face lit up at discovering a new treasure, every time her daughter clutched one of those anonymous gifts with pure joy, Elena found she couldn't do it. Slowly, painfully, the walls around Elena's heart began to crack. She started to see things she hadn't let herself notice before. The exhaustion in Adrian's eyes that matched her own. The way his hands shook slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, like he was holding himself together by sheer will. The careful distance he maintained, respecting her boundaries even when it clearly killed him to stay away. His remorse wasn't performative. It lived in every quiet morning he spent in that booth, every gift he left without demanding credit, every moment he chose Elena's comfort over his own desperate need for forgiveness. But Elena was terrified. Because letting Adrian back in meant risking the fragile peace she'd built. It meant trusting the man who'd destroyed her. And she didn't know if she was strong enough to survive being broken again. One morning, Elena found a letter slipped under the diner door. It was early, the sun just beginning to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Elena had come down to prep for the morning shift, her mind still foggy with the remnants of another sleepless night spent weighing impossible choices. The envelope was simple. Cream-colored paper, her name written in handwriting she recognized instantly. Elena's hands trembled as she picked it up, part of her wanting to throw it away unread, another part desperate to know what words Adrian thought could possibly matter after everything. She made herself a cup of coffee, sat in one of the empty booths, and opened the letter. Adrian's handwriting was surprisingly neat, each word carefully formed like he'd taken his time with every sentence. And as Elena began to read, tears blurred her vision. He wrote everything he should have said 3 years ago. Every apology he'd been too cowardly to offer. Every truth he'd been too afraid to speak. He admitted his cowardice, how Cassandra's family connections had intimidated him, how the fear of scandal had made him weak. He confessed that firing Elena had been the biggest mistake of his life, that choosing power over love had left him empty in ways success could never fill. He wrote about the investigation that had exposed Cassandra's lies, about learning that Elena had been innocent all along, about the suffocating guilt that had consumed him when he'd realized what he'd done. He described the moment he'd seen Lila for the first time, how his heart had stopped, how he'd understood in that instant that he'd missed everything that mattered. But the part that broke Elena was the ending. Adrian didn't ask for forgiveness. Didn't make promises about the future or claim he deserved another chance. He simply asked for permission to know his daughter. To be present in Lila's life, even if Elena never wanted to see him again. To try, however inadequately, to be the father he should have been from the beginning. I was a coward, he'd written in closing. I chose power over love. I chose reputation over truth. And I lost the only thing that ever mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me. But please, Elena. Let me be the father I should have been from the beginning. Let me show our daughter that mistakes can be acknowledged, that damage can be repaired, that love, real love, means showing up even when you're terrified you're too late. Elena wept. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the full weight of the pain she'd buried. She cried for the girl she'd been 3 years ago, the one who'd believed in love and promises. She cried for the months of homelessness and terror, for giving birth alone, for every night she'd rocked Lila while wondering how she'd survive another day. But she also cried for the man Adrian had become, for the remorse that lived in his eyes, for the patience he'd shown, the distance he'd maintained, the gifts he'd given without demanding anything in return. Elena didn't know if she could forgive him, didn't know if trust could be rebuilt after such complete betrayal. But she knew, sitting in that empty diner with tears streaming down her face and Adrian's letter clutched in her hands, that she couldn't keep Lila from him forever. Their daughter deserved to know her father. And maybe, just maybe, Adrian deserved a chance to be one. Elena agreed to let Adrian meet Lila, but under one condition, He had to earn her trust. No grand gestures. No expensive gifts. No attempts to buy his way into their daughter's heart. If Adrian wanted to be Lila's father, he'd have to prove he could show up consistently, that he wouldn't disappear when things got difficult, that he was in this for the right reasons. Adrian agreed without hesitation. They met at a small park on the edge of town. Neutral territory. Safe. Public. Elena arrived early with Lila, who bounced with the restless energy of a 3-year-old excited for an adventure. She didn't understand why they were there or who they were meeting. Elena had kept the explanation simple. They were meeting a friend. Someone who wanted to know Lila very much. When Adrian arrived, Elena's breath caught despite herself. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive suits. Instead, he dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. More vulnerable. He carried a small bag, and his expression held so much hope and fear that Elena almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Lila hid behind Elena's legs when Adrian approached, suddenly shy in the presence of this stranger with the intense eyes. Adrian stopped several feet away, giving her space, and slowly knelt down to be at her eye level. "Hi, Lila," he said softly. "My name is Adrian. Your mom told me you like stories about brave princesses." Lila peeked out from behind Elena, curiosity beginning to override shyness. "How do you know that?" "Because your mom told me. And also because I can tell just by looking at you that you're probably the bravest princess in this whole town." A small smile tugged at Lila's lips. She stepped out from behind Elena, her gray eyes, so like Adrian's, studying him with a child's unfiltered honesty. "Are you my daddy?" The question hung in the air. Elena's heart stopped. They talked about this, she and Adrian, about what they'd say, how they'd explain. But standing here now, watching her daughter ask the question that would change everything, Elena found she couldn't speak. Adrian's voice broke when he answered. "Yes, sweetheart. I am. And I'm so sorry I wasn't here before." "Where were you?" Lila asked with the simple directness of childhood. "I was lost," Adrian said quietly. "But I'm here now. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be here for all the days ahead." Lila considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. Then she reached into the small backpack Elena had packed and pulled out one of the storybooks Adrian had left at the diner. "Will you read to me?" Adrian's eyes filled with tears. "I would love to." They spent the afternoon together. Adrian pushed Lila on the swings, his hand steady and gentle as he sent her soaring higher and higher, her laughter ringing through the park like music. He bought her ice cream from the vendor near the playground, crouched down to wipe chocolate from her chin with the careful attention of someone memorizing every detail. He listened as Lila told him about her favorite books, her best friend from daycare, the way she helped Mama at the diner by folding napkins. Elena watched from a nearby bench, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. She saw the wonder in Adrian's eyes every time Lila laughed. Saw him soaking in every moment like a man who understood exactly what he'd lost and what he'd been given back. Saw the careful way he interacted with their daughter, present, patient, genuinely interested in her world. And she saw Lila begin to trust him. Saw the shyness fade, replaced by the easy affection of a child who instinctively recognized someone who loved her. It was bittersweet. Beautiful. Painful. The beginning of something fragile that could shatter with one wrong move or slowly grow into something real. Elena didn't know which it would be. But watching Adrian and Lila together, seeing the way his face transformed when their daughter smiled at him, she felt something shift inside her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope. But peace was short-lived. Because Cassandra Vale wasn't finished with Adrian or Elena. The trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon. Elena was covering the lunch rush, Lila playing quietly in the small office behind the kitchen where Elena kept toys and books for the long shifts. The diner was busy, filled with the usual mix of locals and travelers, the air thick with conversations and the clatter of dishes. Then the door opened, and Cassandra Vale walked in like a storm given human form. She looked different from the polished woman who'd confronted Elena 3 years ago. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, her designer clothes slightly rumpled, her eyes carrying the wild edge of someone watching their life unravel. She was out on bail, Elena knew. Adrian had warned her that Cassandra's trial was pending, that she might try something desperate. But knowing hadn't prepared Elena for the reality of seeing her again. Cassandra's gaze swept the diner until it landed on Elena. Then her lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles could carry venom. She walked straight to the counter, ignoring the customers waiting for service. So this is where you ended up. How fitting. From one diner to another. Elena's hands tightened on the order pad she was holding. You need to leave. Not until I see what all the fuss is about. Cassandra's eyes scanned the diner, searching. Where is she? The little bastard who ruined everything? The words cut through the noise of the diner like a blade. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Elena felt ice flood her veins. Get out, Elena said, her voice low and deadly. Now. But Cassandra had already spotted movement in the kitchen doorway. Lila had emerged, drawn by the raised voices, her small face curious and uncertain. When Cassandra's gaze landed on her, something cruel flickered in her expression. There she is. My God, Adrian's eyes. How unfortunate for the child. Elena moved faster than thought. She placed herself between Cassandra and Lila, her body a shield, every maternal instinct screaming danger. You don't get to talk about her. You don't get to look at her. Get out of my diner. Cassandra laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your diner? Your child? You think you've won? You think Adrian's going to stay in this pathetic little town, playing house with you? He'll get bored. He always does. The moment something shinier comes along, he'll throw you away again. The words were designed to wound, to plant seeds of doubt, to remind Elena of every abandonment, every broken promise. And they might have worked if Elena hadn't spent 3 years learning exactly how strong she could be. I don't know what Adrian will do, Elena said quietly. But I know what I'll do. I'll protect my daughter. From anyone who tries to hurt her. Including you. Something in Elena's tone must have registered because Cassandra took a small step back. But the venom in her eyes didn't fade. That's when Adrian arrived. He'd been coming for his usual afternoon visit, walking through the door just as Cassandra opened her mouth to deliver another poisoned word. The transformation in his expression was instantaneous, shock giving way to fury giving way to something cold and protective. Cassandra, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd built an empire on his decisions. What are you doing here? Cassandra turned to face him, her mask slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. What am I doing? What are you doing, Adrian? Throwing away everything we built for some waitress and her. She didn't get to finish. Adrian crossed the diner in 3 strides, placing himself between Cassandra and his family. You manipulated me. You lied. You destroyed the woman I loved and tried to destroy my company. But you'll never touch my family again. The diner had gone completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation, unfolding like a scene from a drama no one had bought tickets for. Cassandra's composure finally cracked. Your family? That's rich, Adrian. You threw her away 3 years ago. Don't pretend you're some kind of hero now. You're right, Adrian said quietly. I did. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. But you? You're done. The restraining order was clear. You're not supposed to be within 500 feet of me or anyone I care about. As if summoned by his words, police lights flashed outside. Someone, probably one of the concerned customers, had called them. 2 officers entered the diner, taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Cassandra's face went pale as she realized she'd been caught violating the conditions of her bail. She looked at Adrian one last time, something like desperation and hatred warring in her expression. This isn't over. Yes, Adrian said firmly, it is. The officers escorted Cassandra out. She went without resistance but threw one final venomous look over her shoulder at Elena and Lila. Elena held her daughter close, feeling the little body trembling against her, and knew that some wounds would take time to heal. But for the first time since Adrian had walked back into her life, Elena felt something she hadn't expected. She felt protected. Adrian had stood between them and the woman who destroyed their lives once before. He'd chosen them publicly, definitively, without hesitation. It didn't erase the past. But it was a beginning. That night, Adrian and Elena finally talked. Really talked. For the first time in 3 years. Lila was asleep upstairs, exhausted by the drama of the afternoon and the comfort of Elena's arms afterward. The diner was closed, its lights dim except for the soft glow from the kitchen. Elena and Adrian sat across from each other in one of the booths, coffee growing cold between them, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on the silence. Adrian spoke first. "I'm sorry doesn't cover it. I know that. There aren't words for what I did to you." Elena stared at her hands, wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "No, there aren't. If I could go back," Adrian continued, his voice rough with emotion, "if I could change everything." "But you can't," Elena interrupted. "You can't undo it, Adrian. You can't give me back the months I spent homeless. You can't give me back the terror of giving birth alone, of wondering if I'd survive, if my baby would survive. You can't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep because I'd loved you and you'd thrown me away like garbage." "I know." Adrian's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know. And I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." Elena finally looked up, meeting his gaze. "You broke me. I was shattered into so many pieces I didn't know how to put myself back together. And I did it. Piece by piece, day by day, I rebuilt myself. But I don't know if I can risk that again." The honesty hung between them, raw and painful. Adrian didn't try to minimize it or offer false reassurances. He just nodded, accepting the truth of her words. "I'm terrified," Elena admitted, her voice breaking. "Terrified of trusting you. Terrified of letting you into Lila's life only to have you leave when things get hard. Terrified that I'm making a mistake that will hurt my daughter the way your absence already has." "I can't promise I'll be perfect," Adrian said quietly. "I can't promise I won't make mistakes. But I can promise I'll show up. Every single day. I can promise that walking away from you and Lila was the worst decision I've ever made, and I will never repeat it. I can promise that I'm not the same man who let Cassandra manipulate him, who chose reputation over truth. I'm better now. Because I lost everything that mattered and learned what actually has value." Elena wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But trust wasn't built on words. It was built on actions, on consistency, on time. "Prove it," she said finally. "Not with grand gestures or expensive gifts. Prove it by being the father Lila needs. Prove it by showing up even when it's inconvenient, even when your empire needs you, even when staying is harder than leaving. Prove it by choosing us every single day." Adrian reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers, asking permission. "I will. For as long as you'll let me." Elena looked at his outstretched hand, at the man who destroyed her and the man he claimed to have become. And slowly, carefully, she placed her hand in his. They didn't kiss. Didn't embrace. Didn't make promises about love or forever. But they held hands across that scarred diner table, their touch tentative and fragile and filled with the possibility of something neither dared name yet. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were enough. 6 months later, Elena Monroe stood in a place she never thought she'd be again, believing in second chances. The small town had transformed with the seasons. Winter had given way to spring, and the park where Adrian had first met Lila was now alive with color. Trees burst with new leaves, flowers bloomed in wild abandon, and the air carried the promise of warm days ahead. Elena watched from a bench as Adrian pushed Lila on the swings, their laughter mingling in the afternoon air. It had become their Sunday tradition. Pancakes at Elena's apartment in the morning, where Adrian had learned to make them exactly the way Lila liked, then the park for hours of play until Lila's energy finally ran out. Adrian had kept his promises. All of them. He'd rented a house in town permanently, had stepped back from the daily operations of Blackwell Global to be present for Lila. He showed up for preschool events, for bedtime stories, for the mundane moments that made up the fabric of family life. He'd learned the names of Lila's stuffed animals, her favorite songs, the specific way she liked her sandwiches cut. And slowly, carefully, he'd earned not just Lila's love but Elena's trust. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when Elena's old fears resurfaced, times when she'd pushed him away because letting him close felt too dangerous. But Adrian had stayed. Had given her space when she needed it and shown up consistently when it mattered. Had proven through actions, not words, that he was different now. Lila called him Daddy. The first time she'd said it, casual and easy, like it had always been true, Adrian had cried. He'd scooped her up, held her close, and whispered thank you over and over into her curls. Elena had cried too. But her tears had been complicated, joy for her daughter, grief for the years Adrian had missed, hope for the future they might build. Now, watching them together in the spring sunshine, Elena felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not the fragile, hard-won peace of survival, but something deeper. Something that felt like home. Adrian glanced over, caught her watching, and smiled. It was a smile that held everything they'd been through, the pain, the betrayal, the slow rebuilding of trust. Elena smiled back, and in that exchange was an understanding that needed no words. Lila jumped off the swing mid-flight, landing with the fearless confidence of childhood. "Mama, come play with us." Elena stood, walking toward her daughter and the man who'd once destroyed her and then spent 6 months proving he could be different. As she reached them, Adrian's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become familiar. "Thank you," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "for giving me this chance." Elena looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the billionaire who'd betrayed her but the man who'd learned what mattered. "Thank you for finally choosing us." They didn't have all the answers. Didn't know exactly what their future held. But standing there in the park with their daughter running circles around them, laughing with pure joy, Elena understood something important. Some love stories weren't about perfection. They were about people who made terrible mistakes and then did the hard work of becoming better. They were about trust rebuilt slowly, piece by careful piece. They were about showing up even when it was hard, even when you were scared, even when you didn't know if you'd ever be forgiven. Elena Monroe had saved Adrian Blackwell's life once with an EpiPen and steady hands. But in the end, he'd saved hers too, by learning that love wasn't about power or perfection. It was about showing up. Even when you were late. Even when you were broken. Even when you didn't deserve it. Because some love stories aren't about the beginning. They're about the fight to come back. About the courage it takes to trust again. About learning that second chances, when truly earned, can be even more beautiful than first ones. As the sun set over the park, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena held Adrian's hand and watched their daughter play. And for the first time in 3 years, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. Do you believe in second chances? Could you forgive someone who hurt you this deeply? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, betrayal, and redemption, because everyone deserves to believe that broken things can be made whole again.